Hi, this is Cora Stack here, Dr. Stack. I just want to continue there to explain a couple of further steps in this PR-STV explained series: successive transfers, later surpluses, and the Droop quota. In a previous video, we looked at the basic mathematics behind Ireland's PR-STV voting system. We explained valid votes, invalid votes, non-transferable votes, quotas, surpluses, transfer values. I mean, I think everybody that's in the voting, that goes to voting, should have some awareness of these things, and it should be made aware of what all these things are, so that they understand the system. It's not rocket science once it's explained in a step-by-step manner, which is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to boil it down to the essentials in a very sequential and logical way. So in this video, we go a step further. We ask a couple of more settled questions. Well, we've touched on some of these before. What happens when no candidate reaches the quota on the first count? We've touched on this before. What happens when candidates are eliminated? Their votes transfer, and only then does a candidate reach the quota. And what happens if that candidate now has a surplus? We also look again, this is the important point here I was making earlier, at the Droop quota, and explain why it's the minimum. I was thinking about it as the greatest lower bound. You have this concept in mathematics, but I think a better word for it here is the minimum safe threshold in PR-STV. So it's like the greatest lower bound in concept in mathematics. I can see it like that, I can see the immediate mathematical analogy, but we're going to use it here, the minimum safe threshold in PR-STV. So the basic problem, in a simple example, candidate A reaches the quota on the first count. Candidate A is elected and candidate A is a surplus. We had that before. What happens when the surplus is distributed? But real counts are often more complicated. Sometimes, as we had recently, no candidate reaches the quota on the first count. And we explained what the quota was, the Droop quota, we explained that. In that case, then what happens is the lowest candidate is eliminated. Their votes are transferred. If still no candidate reaches a quota, another candidate may be eliminated. Their votes are transferred too. Only after these transfers might a candidate finally reach the quota. So the question is, if candidate A is first elected only after receiving transferred votes, how is candidate A surplus distributed? So supposing now we're not at the stage where candidate A is elected at stage one. They're elected after a number of eliminations, in which case they have received transfer votes, because if they were below the quota, they would have to have received transfer votes to exceed the quota or to equal the quota. So continuing candidates, this is a very important point as well. Continuing candidates and next available preferences. To understand these, we need one very important phrase: and next available continuing preference. So let me say that again. So to understand this, to understand a concept of continuing candidates and next available preference, we need one important phrase: next available continuing preference. So we'll say that again. To understand this, we need one very important phrase: next available continuing preference. A vote does not necessarily transfer to the next number written on the ballot paper. Even, I had, people were saying to me, oh, it always goes to the number 2, you see, the sort of thing. This is the understanding. No, that's not the case when you look more closely at actually what happens. So a vote does not necessarily transfer to the next number written on the ballot paper. It transfers to the next ranked candidate who is still continuing in the count. So that's referred to. A continuing candidate is a candidate who has not already been elected and has not already been eliminated. So let's define that again and state what that is. A continuing candidate is a candidate who has not already been elected and has not already been eliminated. So if the next preference on the ballot paper is for a candidate who's already been eliminated, that candidate is skipped. And if the next preference is for a candidate who has already been elected, then that candidate is skipped. And you go down and you keep going down to see where you're going to end up. So the count keeps moving down in terms of the ballot, down the ballot paper, until it finds a candidate still continuing. If no candidate is found in this set way, the ballot becomes non-transferable. So a next available preference then is the next preference for a candidate still continuing in the count. So not everybody has a a full appreciation of this. So this is a very important and subtle point. So a next available preference is the next preference for a candidate still continuing in the count. So let's just say skipping an eliminated candidate. So suppose we have a 5-state constituency. No candidate reaches the quota on the first count. Candidate H is the lowest candidate, therefore is eliminated. Candidate H votes are transferred. Still, no candidate reaches the quota. Candidate G, that's just above H, is now the lowest continuing candidate and then is eliminated as part of stage 2. Now we examine candidate G's ballot paper. Supposing one ballot paper says, so we're looking at G is the second one. So instead of just eliminating the first fellow, we're now looking at the sequence. What happens when you go one above him to H? So next we examine G's ballot paper. So we've eliminated H in the previous, the one. Now, supposing we have that done, what happens when we eliminate the next one, the second elimination stage, the second count? Next, we examine candidates G ballot papers. So suppose one ballot paper says it ranks candidate G number 1. That's obviously G's ballot papers. Candidate H number 2. Candidate A number 3. Candidate B number 4. Now, so candidate G is being eliminated. So the vote cannot stay with candidate G. So we're going to look down. That's just his ranking 1 to 4 here. So the vote cannot stay with candidate G. The count looks at the next preference. The second preference is candidate H, but what happens to him? Candidate H has already been eliminated. So you go down again. So candidate H is skipped. The count moves to the third preference. So the third preference is candidate A. So candidate A appears before candidate B in this ballot paper. So the transfer of this vote goes to candidate A. It's a single transferable vote. So the count moves to the third preference. The third preference is candidate A. If candidate A is still continuing, the vote transfers up to the top to candidate A. So the vote goes candidate G, arrow, candidate A. So it does not go to candidate H because candidate H is no longer continuing. So that's the critical point here. So we also can look at skipping an already elected candidate. So now suppose, for another simple example, candidate A has already been elected by the time candidate G is eliminated, right? So consider the ballot paper of candidate G at the elimination stage of candidate G. Supposing it has, for number 1, obviously candidate G, number 2 preference on that ballot paper, candidate H, number 3, candidate A, and number 4, candidate B. Well, H has been eliminated, A has been elected, and then you have candidate B. So G is gone because that's eliminated. That's just eliminated. That's stage 2 of the elimination process. H has been eliminated in the previous count. A was elected, and then candidate B is a continuing candidate. So candidate G is being eliminated. Candidate A has already been eliminated, so H is skipped. Candidate A has already been elected, so A is also skipped. So the next preference is candidate B. If candidate B is still continuing, the vote transfers to candidate B. So you can visualize an arrow going from candidate G, arrow, to candidate B this time. This is why the next available preference must be understood carefully. It does not simply mean the next number on the ballot paper, which a lot of people have a misunderstanding about. And it's understandable if this isn't explained this way, or if it isn't explained to you. I mean, it's very clear to me how people could be confused about this. It means the next candidate in the voters' ranking who is still able to receive the vote. So when a vote becomes non-transferable, this is another important point. Next, consider the ballot paper, say, for a simple example, at the stage where G, the second count, G is eliminated, H has been eliminated on the first count, or the second count, say, if candidate A has been elected on the first count. So, no, candidate A is not elected yet. So, candidate A has already been elected. Sorry. So candidate A, so next consider this ballot paper, say, candidate G is number 1 because it's G's ballot paper. Then his second preference, his or her second preference, or the second preference will just say candidate H, and the third preference is candidate A. So candidate G is being eliminated. See what's happening here now? Can you say now, if you were a student, what would be the question I'd ask is, What's the answer in this case? Everybody would put that. So candidate G, candidate H, candidate A. Candidate G is being eliminated. Candidate A has already been eliminated. Candidate A has been elected. The question you'd ask the students, well, what's the, where are we at in this case? Well, what classification have we got for this ballot? There's no further preference marked. So there's no continuing candidate to receive the vote. So the vote then becomes non-transferable. This is important, very important. A non-transferable vote is not necessarily that a ballot with only one preference. A ballot may contain several preferences and still become non-transferable at some stage if all later preferences are for candidates who are no longer continuing. So it's a mouthful, but it's when you bring it down to 4 candidates, I think, and look at the various scenarios, it's possible to understand it. So let's look now at a 5-seater example. Candidate A elected first on the 3rd count, say, just to again vary the where candidate A is elected on the 3rd count. So let us look at a full example. Suppose we're now in a 5-seat constituency, which can often happen. The quota, supposing, is 8,000. On the first count, no candidate reaches the quota. Candidate A has 7,400 first preferences. Candidate A is close but not elected. There are 600 off it. Candidate H is the lowest candidate, so is eliminated. Candidate H votes transfer. Candidate A, supposing, receives 300 votes from candidate H. So candidate A new total goes up on the screen, the big white screen there that you see, 7400 plus 3000, 7700. Candidate A is still below the quota of 8,000. Still no candidate has been elected. So we go again to the next count, which eliminates candidate G is now the lowest continuing candidate and is eliminated. So it's just learning the language, really. The lowest continuing candidate is then eliminated. Candidate G votes transfer in a kind of initiative fashion. Candidate A, say, receives 600 votes. So candidate A new total is, in this count, 7,700 plus 600. And then you have a huge big, everybody putting up their hands and a big shout, and, so-and-so put up on the arms or whatever, the shoulders, 8,300, because he succeeded, he or she, or, the person has, they, she, or whatever we want to call these people, or, mention all these names. I don't know what the official wording of this is. How do you describe the candidate? I suppose you just describe them as the candidate. It might be the best person way to put it, the candidate, rather than getting into things that might So 8300. So candidate A, we'll just call the candidate A. We won't describe. We'll just describe the candidate as candidate A. Candidate A has now exceeded the quota and is elected by, and has a surplus, obviously. Candidate A is the first person elected, but only on the 3rd count. Right, so we looked at what would happen if candidate A was elected in the first count. Now let's bring it down, maybe in the 3rd count. So candidate A is the first person elected, but only on the 3rd count. Candidate A surplus is 8300 minus 800, which is 300. So candidate A has a surplus, clearly, of 300. Which votes are used? This is really now where the complexity, it's a bit more complex to understand the distribution of the surplus in this case. So that's why I wanted to do the easy case first and build it up step by step so we could understand this step, because we had to understand all the previous steps. We were building up a system whereby the complexity was explained bit by bit by that. So candidate A's total is made up of different parts. Candidate A's first preference votes is 7,400. Transfer for candidate H, that was the first to be eliminated, was 300. And transfer for candidate G, the second, 600. Those two brought the candidate A over 8,000 to 8300. Candidate A's surplus is 300. The question is, do we distribute? How do we distribute all of candidate A votes, or how is the surplus distributed? So we don't distribute all the votes, obviously. The candidate A reaches the quota only after receiving the parcel from candidate G. So candidate A surplus is normally distributed from the parcel that brought A over the quota. So that's the rule. So this is the parcel received from candidate G. So the count is not necessarily usually reopen all of candidate A accumulated votes. Instead, it examines the relevant parcel. So this is just a rule here that it looks at the parcel that brought candidate A over the quota. So that required candidates G. Now I'm over the quota, yeah. So it required candidates G's contribution. So the surplus is normally distributed from the parcel that caused the candidate to exceed the quota. So I might look at that again now, just to investigate this point a bit further, just looking at it from a logical point of view. Supposing the parcel from candidate G to candidate A contained ballot papers showing the following next available preference after candidate A. Candidate B, 200 papers. So candidate C, 150 papers, and candidate D, 100 papers. No further usable preferences, 50 papers, total papers, 500. So the transferable papers are 200 plus 150 plus 100, which is 450, because there's 50 non-transferable papers. The 50 papers with no further usable preferences are non-transferable. Candidate A surplus is 300. So the transfer value is, again, the surplus divided by the number of transferable votes in the relevant parcel, right? So the relevant parcel is the transfer papers in the so the total papers in that parcel was 500. So the transfer is this gives 300 divided by 450, which is 0.667 approximately. Each transferable ballot in that parcel transfers onward at approximately 0.667 of a vote. So the surplus is distributed approximately as follows. Candidate B receives 200 multiplied by 0.667, which is 133.34. Candidate C, if you do the same calculation, multiply the transfer formula there, it's 100. Candidate D is 100 by 6.667, which is 66.67. The total transferred is approximately 300. So only candidate A's surplus is transferred. No more than the surplus moves forward. So it's the surplus. So if we can, that's again a little bit complex. So that's quite complex, that particular point. So again, supposing the parcel for a